The message had been left on Hugo Rodriguez's phone 7 times. The same 7 seconds of silence and then unmistakably breathing. He had not told anyone. To tell someone would be to make it real, and Hugo Rodriguez was not prepared, not yet, for the terrible weight of reality, pressing down upon his ribs like something ancient crouching upon his chest in the dark. He sat in his apartment on Verlaine Street, the night stretched thin and membrane, like around him, and he listened to the message again. The 7th time. Always 7. He did not know why that number had begun to feel like a wound. The cat appeared on his windowsill at 2:30, a creature utterly black, utterly without marking, as though something had cut its silhouette from the fabric of the visible world. Hugo watched it. It watched him back with eyes the precise color of old amber, of preserved things, of time made viscous and still. He had never owned a cat. He had not opened the window. Rebel, he thought, the word surfacing from nowhere, unbidden, the way certain words do when the mind begins to lose its careful architecture. He would call it rebel. He did not question this impulse. Questioning impulses had begun to feel dangerous, like pressing one's tongue against a loose tooth. You could never be certain what you might dislodge. His thoughts came in fractures now. Had they always? He could not recall the texture of his thinking before the messages began, before the 7 silences filled with breath that was not his own, before the numbers scratched into his kitchen wall. Not carved, not written, simply there as though the plaster itself had remembered something Hugo had not yet learned. The city outside breathed its ordinary corruption, its beautiful indifferent filth, taxis cutting yellow wounds through the dark, and somewhere below, a woman laughed a laugh too bright for the hour. Hugo pressed his palm flat against the glass. Cold. Always so terribly cold, the glass, as though the outside world had been replaced with something that merely resembled it. The cat, Rebel, made no sound. Its tail moved once, a slow, constricted curl, like something tightening around a throat. Hugo's phone lit the room white. 7 new messages. He understood then, with a particular clarity that visits only the very frightened and the very mad, that the urban legend his grandmother had whispered to him at age 7, the one about the listener, the one she had immediately refused to repeat, had never been a legend at all. It had been a warning, and he had already been found. Hugo Rodriguez did not sleep that night, which meant he was awake to hear the scratching begin at precisely 3 a.m, that hollow consecrated hour when the membrane between what is seen and what hungers to be seen grows gossamer, thin and unreliable. The scratching came from inside the walls. Rebel did not flinch. The cat sat motionless upon the sill, a black apostrophe against the grey urban dark, and Hugo found himself envying the creature its stillness, its absolute and sovereign calm. He himself was anything but calm. His thoughts moved like startled birds, wheeling and colliding, and he pressed both hands against his temples as though he might physically contain the fracturing. The listener, his grandmother's voice returned to him now. Abuela Carmen, small and iron-spined, smelling of rosewater and old devotion. And her voice had dropped to something barely breath when she had spoken that name. He had been 7 years old, sitting at her kitchen table in San Antonio, and she had begun the story the way all true and terrible things begin, accidentally as though the words had escaped her before wisdom could catch them. It finds you through sound, she had said, through your own voice, Mijo. Once it hears you speak its name, and then she had stopped. Had pressed her lips together with a finality that had frightened him more profoundly than any continuation could have, had made the sign of the cross with a hand that trembled. Hugo had spoken the name 3 weeks ago. Drunk, stupid, rebellious in that particularly self-destructive way of men who have ceased to believe in consequences, he had been at Marco's apartment, and Marco had pulled up the thread on some dark corner of the internet, and they had laughed. And Hugo had read the name aloud because it had seemed the sophisticated thing to do, the rational, fearless, modern thing. Marco had not returned his calls since. The scratching intensified, directional now, moving from the bedroom wall toward the kitchen, and Hugo followed it the way one follows a sound in a dream, against every reasonable instinct drawn by something deeper than reason, older than caution. The kitchen was dark. He did not turn on the light. The numbers on the wall were visible anyway, faintly phosphorescent, 7 sets of 7, and beside them now, freshly apparent, a single sentence in handwriting that was undeniably, impossibly, horrifyingly his own. You already invited me in. Rebel appeared in the doorway behind him. The cat made a sound then. Not a meow. Nothing so domestic, nothing so reassuring, but a low, constricted keen, like grief compressed into a single sustained note. Hugo's mouth opened. He could not remember if he had ever written those words. He could not remember if he had not. There are things the mind does when it can no longer trust itself. It bargains, it rationalizes. It constructs elaborate and internally consistent architectures of alternative explanation. Because the alternative to alternative explanation is the yawning acknowledgement that reality has become something other than what one was promised it would be. Hugo Rodriguez bargained. He told himself the writing was old, a previous tenant's strange confession, somehow invisible until this precise moment of vulnerability and sleeplessness. He told himself the messages on his phone were a prank. Marco hiding somewhere laughing, that particular laugh of his, breathless and bent double. He told himself the numbers on the wall were coincidence, pattern recognition, the human mind's desperate and indiscriminate hunger to find meaning in the random. He told himself these things standing in his kitchen at 3:27 in the morning, and not one single syllable of it settled. Rebel watched him from the doorway with those amber eyes that seemed to contain something Hugo could only describe as pity, and that was perhaps the most disturbing element of the entire terrible evening. That a cat of unknown origin and impossible entry should look upon him with an expression so legible, so heartbreakingly human in its resigned compassion, as though the creature had witnessed this precise unraveling before, and had long since exhausted its capacity for surprise. "What are you?" Hugo asked it. His voice sounded foreign to him, constricted and strange, as though his throat had forgotten the casual mechanics of speech. The cat blinked once, slowly, the way cats do when they mean to communicate safety, trust, the feline equivalent of an open hand. Hugo did not feel safe. Hugo felt the opposite of safe, in ways for which he did not yet have adequate vocabulary. He pulled his laptop open on the kitchen table, pushing aside 3 days of unopened mail and a coffee cup wearing a ring of dried brown like a monk's tonsure. The internet, that vast and indiscriminate reliquary of human terror, had 17 distinct threads about the listener, and Hugo read them all with the focused, febrile intensity of a man reading his own diagnosis. The pattern was immutable across every account, every geographic variation, every cultural translation of the legend. 7 messages, a name spoken aloud, always in disbelief, always in the company of others who would subsequently become unreachable, numbers appearing in one's own handwriting. And then, this was the detail that made Hugo's vision briefly white at the edges, the arrival of a black cat. Not a demon, not a harbinger, a witness. The listener, the threads collectively suggested, did not come for your body. It did not want your blood or your breath or your measurable physical life. It wanted something considerably more intimate and considerably more difficult to name. It wanted the part of you that persisted in the dark, the part that continued thinking after the lights went out. It wanted to listen to you think. Hugo slammed the laptop shut. In the sudden darkness, Rebel's eyes held their amber light like 2 small, sovereign flames. And from inside the walls, as though responding to the closure of the screen, the scratching resumed with renewed and patient deliberation. Moving now in a direction, Hugo recognized with the sick certainty of a man who has stopped bargaining entirely toward his bedroom, toward where he would eventually, inevitably have to sleep. Sleep came for Hugo Rodriguez, the way unwanted things always come. Not announced, not negotiated, but suddenly and completely, his body overruling the frantic parliament of his mind with the blunt democratic majority of exhaustion. He had moved to the couch, unwilling to surrender the bedroom to whatever patience was assembling itself behind his walls, and he had sat upright with his back pressed against the armrest, and Rebel's warm, impossible weight settled against his thigh, and then there was nothing, and then there was the dream. It was not the kind of dream one forgets upon waking. He stood in a room he recognized as his apartment, and simultaneously recognized as something wearing his apartment, the way a thing wears a mask. The proportions subtly wrong, the ceilings a fraction too high, the shadows pooling in corners that did not correspond to any light source. The windows opening not onto Verlaine Street, but onto a darkness, so absolute and so textured that it seemed less like the absence of light, and more like the presence of something that had swallowed light and found it wanting. Abuela Carmen stood at his kitchen table. She was as he remembered her from childhood, and also as he had last seen her, 3 years ago in the hospice in San Antonio, the illness having reduced her with its characteristic cruelty. But here she was neither, or both, her eyes carrying that particular sharp and undeceived intelligence that had survived every diminishment her body had endured. She was looking at him with an expression he had seen only once before, on the morning she had begun and then refused to finish the story of the listener. Pure, distilled, maternal terror. "You spoke the name," she said, and her voice in the dream had that quality particular to voices in dreams, simultaneously intimate and enormously distant, as though she were speaking from the bottom of something deep and filled with still water. "I know, Abuela," Hugo said. "I know I was—" "You don't know," she said, and the sharpness of it silenced him in the way only she had ever been able to silence him, with that particular combination of love and absolute authority. "You think knowing the legend means you understand it. You think Marco is hiding." "Hugo, Nijo," She paused, and in the pause the textured darkness outside the wrong window seemed to press closer, curious, attentive. Marco is not hiding. Hugo felt the cold move through him then. Not the cold of the glass, not the cold of the apartment, but a cold that seemed to originate somewhere interior, as though something had opened a window inside his chest. "Where is he?" Hugo asked, though some rebel fraction of his consciousness already understood that he did not want the answer, that the answer existed in a category of knowledge from which there was no comfortable return. His grandmother opened her mouth. What emerged was not her voice. It was breathing. Slow, rhythmic, patient beyond all human patience. The precise breathing from the 7 messages, filling the dream kitchen, filling his chest cavity, filling the spaces between his thoughts with its terrible and intimate attention. And beneath the breathing, just barely audible, just barely distinguishable from silence, something that might have been words in a language, older than the human apparatus of meaning, making something that spoke directly to the part of Hugo that existed before he had learned to call himself Hugo. He woke screaming. Rebel was standing on his chest, all 4 paws planted with deliberate and grounding pressure, amber eyes enormous in the pre-dawn dark, and the cat held his gaze with such focused and communicative intensity that Hugo understood, with a certainty that bypassed rational evaluation entirely, that the creature had woken him deliberately, had intervened. His phone showed 7 missed calls, all from Marco's number. Marco, whom he had not heard from in 3 weeks. Marco, whose apartment Hugo had driven past 4 days ago to find dark and male, thick and sealed with the particular stillness of a place that has been empty long enough to forget the shape of habitation. Hugo's thumb hovered over the callback button. Rebel made that sound again, that low, constricted keen, grief compressed, warning compressed, and placed one deliberate paw upon Hugo's hand. "Don't," the gesture said, as clearly as any word. Hugo put the phone face down on the couch cushion and sat in the grey early morning and breathed. Simply breathed, counting his own breaths the way his therapist had once taught him. Back when his problems had been the ordinary manageable kind. Back when the architecture of his reality had been something he could reasonably rely upon. Outside, dawn was assembling itself over the city with its usual indifferent beauty. Inside, on his kitchen wall, there were now 8 sets of numbers. He had counted 7 before he slept. Hugo Rodriguez spent the daylight hours of that Thursday in the particular frenzy of a man who has decided that any action is preferable to the yawning passivity of waiting for something incomprehensible to complete its incomprehensible designs upon him. He called his therapist first. Reyes, whose office smelled of sandalwood, and whose voice carried the practiced warmth of someone who had heard every species of human suffering and had developed, through long exposure, a compassionate immunity to shock. Hugo sat on his couch with Rebel pressed against his side and described, with as much sequential coherence as he could assemble, the events of the past 3 weeks, the messages, the numbers, the writing on the wall, the dream. Dr. Reyes was quiet for a long moment. "Hugo," she said finally, in that careful tone he recognized as the tone she reserved for conversations requiring particular delicacy. "When did you last sleep a full night? When did you last eat a proper meal?" He had known, even as he dialed, that this was how it would go. He had known because he would have said the same things once, in what felt like a previous incarnation of himself. The Hugo who had believed in the sufficiency of rational explanation, who had found comfort in the clean geometries of cause and effect. That Hugo felt very far away now, separated from the present moment by 3 weeks of accumulated terror and a distance that could not be measured in any unit he knew. "I'm not sleep-deprived, Elena," he said, using her first name the way he only did when he needed her to hear him as a person rather than a patient. "I'm not having an episode. Something is happening. Another pause." "Longer. Come in tomorrow morning," she said. "First appointment. And Hugo, don't be alone tonight if you can help it." He hung up and sat with the advice, turning it over, examining its edges. "Don't be alone." The council assumed that the threat was interior, a thing generated by his own fractured cognition, and therefore that the presence of another person would constitute protection. Hugo was no longer confident that this assumption held. He was no longer confident that another person's presence would represent anything more than the expansion of the threat's available audience. Rebel shifted against him, and Hugo looked down at the cat with the complicated gratitude one develops for the only reliable constant in an unreliable world. "What do you know," Hugo murmured, "that I don't?" The cat regarded him with those ancient amber eyes and said nothing, which was, Hugo had come to understand, a form of communication in itself. He spent the afternoon at his laptop, no longer consulting horror forums and crowdsourced mythology, but working backward through local records, newspaper archives, the digital detritus of the city's documented history. If the listener was an urban legend, it had a point of origin, a patient zero, a first telling that had metastasized through the culture's nervous system into something that now lived in the collective dark. Every legend was someone's testimony. First, every myth was once a report. He found it at 4:30, buried in a digitized archive of a local newspaper from 1947. A small item, barely 3 paragraphs, the kind of story printed in the spaces between advertisements for war bonds and hair tonic. A man on Verlaine Street, the article noted with the period's characteristic terseness, had been found in his apartment in a state of profound catatonia. Unresponsive, his eyes open and his expression, one that the attending physician had described, in language unusual for a medical professional, as listening to something the rest of us cannot hear. The man's name had been Hugo Reyes, the same surname as his therapist, which was almost certainly meaningless, which Hugo noted and then could not stop noting, the way one cannot stop pressing a bruise once its location has been discovered. He scrolled further, hands not entirely steady, and found a follow-up piece published 2 weeks later. Hugo Reyes had not recovered. He had remained in that listening posture, that terrible attentive stillness, for 11 days, neither eating nor drinking, attended by nurses who reported becoming inexplicably uneasy in his presence, reporting dreams of rooms with wrong proportions and windows opening onto textured dark. On the 12th day, he had simply stopped. Not died, the article was careful to note, in the way articles of that era were careful about such distinctions, simply stopped, as though something had finished with him. His apartment had been on the 4th floor of a building on Verlaine Street. Hugo lived on the 4th floor. He looked up from the laptop slowly, with the deliberate care of someone who suspects that moving too quickly might dislodge something essential, and found Rebel sitting on the kitchen table directly before him, which the cat had never done before, blocking his view of the wall with the specific and purposeful quality of an entity that does not want him to see what is written there. Hugo gently moved the cat aside. There were now 9 sets of numbers on the wall, and beneath them, in that handwriting, that was his, and was not his, a single new addition to the sentence that had been accumulating, piece by piece, in the dark hours while Hugo slept, or did not sleep, like a letter being written by increments, like a confession being extracted syllable by syllable from some deep and unwilling place. You already invited me in, and I have been here. Rebel made no sound this time. The silence was considerably worse. There are moments in the dissolution of a man, certainty that function as hinges, points at which the door of the life he has known swings irrevocably away from its familiar frame and opens onto something for which no prior experience has furnished adequate preparation. Hugo Rodriguez had passed through several such hinges in the preceding weeks, but standing in his kitchen on that Thursday evening, reading those 11 words in his own impossible handwriting, he understood that he had just passed through the last one. There was no returning to the man he had been before. That man was a door now closed. He photographed the wall with a steadiness that surprised him, the calm that descends sometimes upon the completely terrified, that eerie operational clarity that has nothing to do with courage and everything to do with the mind. Celeste. Resort protocols engaging when all softer systems have failed. He photographed it from multiple angles, close and far, and then he sat at his kitchen table with Rebel in his lap and examined the images on his phone with the methodical detachment of a forensic technician examining evidence from a crime scene in which he was simultaneously the investigator and the primary victim. The handwriting was his. He had looked at enough of his own written words in his 4 years to be beyond doubt on this point. The particular formation of his capital Y, the way his are closed at the top with a slight leftward lean, the pressure of the strokes, these were his, as identifiable as a fingerprint, as intimate as a voice. He had not written them. Both of these things were true simultaneously, and Hugo sat with their impossible coexistence the way one sits with a diagnosis that has not yet fully arrived in the body, present in the mind, but not yet metabolized into the cellular knowledge of what one's life has now become. Think, he told himself, in the voice he used for serious self. Address, the voice that had guided him through his dissertation defense and his father's funeral and the 3 months after Elena, not Dr. Reyes, but the other Elena. The one who had taken her houseplants and her particular way of laughing and left a silence shaped exactly like her in every room. Think, Hugo? You are a rational man. Apply that. Rebel looked up at him with an expression that seemed to contain, if Hugo was not projecting, and he was increasingly uncertain about the reliability of his projections, a gentle but firm disagreement with the premise that rationality remained the appropriate instrument for the current situation. He thought about the man from 1947, Hugo Reyes, same building, same floor, same name in the marrow of it, if not the surface. 11 days of that terrible listening stillness before he simply stopped. Hugo Rodriguez counted backward from that data point with the grim arithmetic of a man calculating the distance to an obstacle he can see approaching. 3 weeks since he had spoken the name. 7 messages from the beginning. The numbers on the wall multiplying by 1 each night, with the patient incrementalism of something that understood time differently than its quarry did, for whom urgency was an irrelevant concept, because the conclusion was not in question. Only the interval. He needed to find someone who had survived this. The forums had been full of accounts, breathless and semi, literate and cross, contaminated with the usual internet noise of performance and fabrication, but there had been. Hugo now recalled with the sudden sharpened recall of a mind newly motivated, one thread distinct from the others. Older, written without the self, conscious genre awareness of someone who had consumed too much horror content and was now unconsciously narrating their experience through its conventions. Written in the flat, exhausted, precise language of someone reporting rather than performing. The username had been Valenist4W Valane Street, 4th floor. West, facing unit. Hugo S. unit faced west. He opened his laptop with hands that had resumed their trembling, the operational calm having spent itself, and navigated back through his browser history to the thread. It took him longer than it should have. His mind doing that fracturing thing again, thoughts arriving in the wrong order, chronology becoming a suggestion rather than a structure, and he was aware as he searched of Rebel S' steady warm weight in his lap, the cat S purring alow. Constricted vibration against his thighs, and he focused on that physical reality, that undeniable present, tense fact of warmth and sound, the way a person focuses on a fixed point to maintain balance. He found the thread. Valenus T4W had posted once, 7 years ago, and never again. The post was long, methodical, and written in the particular register of someone who has made peace with not being believed and is writing anyway, for the record, for whoever might need it, the way people leave notes in the margins of books they do not expect to survive. Hugo read it with the whole of his attention. Halfway through, he stopped breathing. Then he read the final paragraph 3 times. Each time with the same result, the same cold certainty spreading through him like water finding the level of a space it has been poured into. The only way to interrupt the process the post read is to make it listen back. The listener has never encountered silence from the inside. It does not know what to do with a mind that has gone entirely, deliberately, voluntarily quiet. Not sleep, not unconsciousness, chosen silence. The kind that requires more discipline than most people possess, because it means silencing not just speech but thought itself, and doing it before the 10th night, because on the 10th night the numbers stop and something else begins, and I do not know what that something else is, and I do not intend to find out. Hugo looked at the wall. 9 sets of numbers. Rebel stood abruptly in his lap, turned in a precise circle, and sat back down facing the wall, the amber eyes fixed and unblinking, the posture one Hugo had come to recognize over these weeks of strange and accelerating companionship. Alert, watchful. Something is coming, that posture said. Hugo closed the laptop and sat in the dark of his kitchen, and began, with a desperation as pure and focused as anything he had ever felt, to practice the impossible discipline of thinking nothing at all. Silence, Hugo Rodriguez discovered, is not the absence of sound. It is a country with its own geography, its own weather systems, its own predators, and the mind, that restless and ungovernable instrument, does not surrender its noise without a fight of extraordinary and exhausting intimacy. He sat in the dark for 3 hours attempting it. The first hour belonged entirely to failure. Thoughts arrived with the relentless democracy of uninvited guests, each one trailing its retinue of associations and anxieties. Marco, has your answer door? His grandmother, his truncated warning. The 1947 newspaper item with its clinical description of a man who had simply stopped. The 9 sets of numbers visible, even in the dark with their faint and horrible luminescence, as though they were not written upon the wall but growing from it, as though the wall itself was slowly and methodically remembering something. Hugo chased each thought away, and 3 arrived to replace it, and he understood for the first time with genuine bodily comprehension why meditation teachers spoke of the practice in terms of warfare rather than rest. Rebel sat facing the wall and did not move. The second hour was marginally better and considerably worse. He achieved, in isolated intervals, something approaching the condition described by Valenus T4W, a momentary quieting of the interior noise, a brief and fragile cessation in which he existed without the commentary of existing. Pure sensation without the narrator, who usually stood between Hugo Rodriguez and his raw experience of the world, translating everything into language, into story, into the continuous autobiography a conscious mind constructs and revises and constructs again until the moment it stops. In those intervals he felt the apartment differently. felt it as a space with a presence in it that was neither his nor Rebel S, a third quality of attention that distributed itself through the rooms like a change in air pressure, like the feeling before lightning, vast and patient and oriented entirely toward him. It was listening. He could feel it listening the way one feels observed from behind. That primitive, pre-rational animal knowledge that something with intentions has directed its attention toward the back of your skull. Hugo had felt this intermittently for 3 weeks and had been attempting with decreasing success to attribute it to stress, to sleeplessness, to the ordinary hypersensitivity of an overtaxed nervous system. In the silence of the second hour, stripped of the comfortable insulation of his own mental noise, he felt it with a clarity that made attribution impossible. The listener was in the apartment. Had been in the apartment, he understood then with the sick recursive logic of the sentence on his wall for considerably longer than 3 weeks. Had perhaps always been in this apartment, in this specific unit on the 4th floor of this building on Verlaine Street, waiting with the patience of something that does not experience waiting as loss, waiting for the particular resonance of a specific kind of mind, the kind that would speak the name not in genuine belief, but in that most dangerous of registers, the ironic disbelief of the educated. The performative fearlessness of the rational man demonstrating his rationality to an audience of his peers. The kind of mind that would be, once captured, endlessly interesting to listen to. Hugo felt something move through the walls. Not the scratching of the previous nights. This was subtler. A displacement, a shift in the quality of the dark in the hallway, and Rebel turned for the first time from the kitchen wall and looked toward the hallway entrance with those amber eyes gone very wide. The pupils expanded to swallow almost all of the gold. And the cat made a sound Hugo had not heard before, not the keen of warning nor the weighted silence of watchful patience, but something that operated below the register of sound, a vibration felt in the sternum rather than heard with the ear. Hugo pressed his palms flat against his thighs and returned to the silence. The silence had a quality to it that the second hour had not possessed. A texture, as though the air itself had become attentive, as though the act of attempting interior quiet had done something to the atmosphere of the room, had altered the dynamic between Hugo and the presence in some way he could not yet fully pass. He thought of Verlainist it 4W. S-words, it has never encountered silence from the inside, and he understood them differently now than he had reading them on the screen. The listener fed on the noise of conscious minds the way certain creatures feed on light or heat, drawing sustenance from the continuous generative hum of human thought. And the withdrawal of that sustenance was not merely depriving it of food, it was making it uncomfortable. He could feel that too in the shifted quality of the presence. Something that had been settled, proprietorial, unhurried, had acquired a new quality. Not urgency, not precisely, but a sharpened attention, a focusing, the way a predator focuses when its prey does something unexpected. Good, Hugo thought. And then immediately recognized the thought as noise and released it. Rebel crossed the kitchen and climbed into his lap with careful deliberateness, turned once, and pressed the full weight of its small body against Hugo's abdomen. And the warmth of it was extraordinary, was almost hallucinatory in its realness, and Hugo held onto that realness the way a man in deep water holds onto the only solid thing within reach. The 10th night was tomorrow. Hugo Rodriguez sat in his dark kitchen on the 9th night and practiced silence with the focused desperation of a man who has finally completely and without reservation understood what is at stake. Not his body, not his measurable and physical life, but the interior country of his consciousness. The private and irreplaceable noise of being specifically himself. At some point between 3 and 4 in the morning he achieved it. True silence. The kind that requires everything. The presence in the apartment went very still, and then, for the first time in 3 weeks, the breathing in Hugo, Ossia stopped. In the sudden and extraordinary quiet, Rebel began very softly to purr. The silence held until dawn, and then Hugo Rodriguez made the mistake of thinking about breakfast. It was such an ordinary thought, so aggressively mundane in its specificity. He had been considering eggs, the particular comfort of scrambled eggs with the pepper his mother had always added. The cast iron pan he kept on the back left burner, and the thought arrived with such domestic innocence that he had welcomed it before he recognized it for what it was. The mind's mutiny. The self's irrepressible insistence on its own continuity, its own small hungers, its refusal to remain dissolved in the pure and disciplined nothing he had so painstakingly achieved in the deep hours before dawn. The breathing returned instantly. Not gradually, not tentatively, but with the immediate and proprietary confidence of something resuming a possession it had never genuinely relinquished, merely been temporarily inconvenienced in exercising. Hugo felt it against the interior wall of his left ear, warm and rhythmic and patient, and the patience of it was perhaps the worst element. There was no frustration in it, no indication that the preceding hours of silence had cost the listener anything meaningful. It had simply waited, the way deep water waits, knowing that whatever falls into it must eventually stop swimming. Hugo pressed his fists against his knees and tried to return to the silence. He could not find it. The door to that country, which had taken him the better part of 3 hours to locate, and then the remainder of the night to hold open through sheer exhausted will, had closed while his attention was occupied with eggs and cast iron and his mother's particular generosity with black pepper. And he sat in the grey morning light searching for the handle, and finding only the smooth and featureless surface of a mind that had spent its discipline and had nothing remaining to spend. Rebel watched him from the table with an expression that contained no judgment and no comfort, only the clear-eyed witnessing of a creature that has seen exactly this before. Think, Hugo told himself, and then caught the thought and recognized the recursion. Thinking about not thinking was still thinking, was in fact a particularly insidious variety of thinking, the snake consuming its own tail, the mind using its own activity to simulate the cessation of its activity. And he had spent enough of the previous night discovering the difference between genuine interior silence and its convincing imitation to know that he was nowhere near the real thing. He needed help. The acknowledgement arrived with the specific relief and specific humiliation of all such acknowledgements. That moment when the pride of self-sufficiency finally costs more than the price of admission to dependence. Hugo Rodriguez had spent his adult life constructing himself as a man who managed things, who processed difficulty internally and emerged from the other side of it with his composure intact and his narrative of competence undisturbed. 3 weeks of ontological siege had reduced this construction to something he could see clearly for the first time in its true dimensions. Not strength, not resilience, but a habit of isolation dressed in the language of capability. He picked up his phone. He did not call Dr. Reyes. He did not call his sister in Phoenix, who would have been kind and frightened, and entirely without applicable resources. He opened his browser and navigated back to the forum thread, to the post by Valenisted 4W, and he read it again in the morning light with the different eyes of someone who had now partially inhabited the experience it described, rather than merely reading about it from the outside. There was a contact embedded in the post, subtle enough that he had missed it the first time. Not an email address or a phone number, but a reference to a specific used bookstore on the east side of the city, a shop called Carmichael S., and a specific book on a specific shelf. The post indicated with the oblique precision of someone accustomed to communicating in ways that the listener could not intercept, because the listener operated through sound and electronics, and the interior noise of minds, but had not, apparently, mastered the reading of physical text. Inside that book there would be what Valenus 34W called the fuller instructions. Hugo read the address. Memorized it without writing it down, without speaking it, obeying an instinct he was no longer interested in questioning. He looked at Rebel. "Will you be here when I get back?" he asked. The cat blinked once, slowly. Hugo took that as a yes. He dressed quickly in the bedroom, avoiding the direct sight of the kitchen wall, though he counted in his peripheral vision, with the automatic and unwilling arithmetic he had developed over 9 days, the sets of numbers. 9 still. No 10th set. Not yet, though the day was young and the logic of the progression suggested that the 10th would arrive with the coming dark, and what Valenus T4W had described as something else beginning would begin. Outside, the city was conducting its ordinary morning commerce with magnificent indifference to Hugo's situation. Coffee carts and dog walkers, and the particular quality of March light that always struck him as provisional, as though the warmth were on loan and might be recalled at any moment. He walked rather than taking the subway, unwilling to enclose himself underground, needing the open sky above him with a physicality that went beyond preference into something closer to medical requirement. Carmichael, his books, occupied a narrow storefront between a dry cleaner and a closed restaurant, and it had the appearance of a place that had been quietly present for so long that the neighborhood had simply grown accustomed to looking past it, the way one looks past familiar furniture. The man behind the counter was old and small and possessed of the particular stillness of someone who spends most of his time surrounded by things that do not require responses. Hugo described the book. The man looked at him for a long moment with eyes that were, Hugo realized with a start that moved through him like cold current, the precise amber of Rebel's eyes, which was certainly a coincidence which Hugo noted and then could not stop noting. "We've been expecting someone," the man said. "Not you. Not a customer. Someone." He produced the book from beneath the counter without consulting any shelf, set it before Hugo with the careful deliberateness of a man transferring something that requires respect in the handling, and when Hugo reached for it, the man held it a moment longer, his small dry hand resting on the cover, and said in a voice pitched below the threshold of any possible eavesdropping, "You have until tonight. The silence alone won. To finish it, You need to understand what it is actually afraid of, and that is not quiet, young man. Quiet is merely what gets its attention. He released the book. What it cannot survive is being truly, completely known." Hugo looked down at the book in his hands. On the cover, in faded gilt lettering, was a title that made the cold move through him again. Deeper this time, reaching places the previous cold had not reached. The interior, a field guide to what listens. The author, name below it, was Hugo Reyes, 1940. 8. 1 year after the newspaper article had reported that Hugo Reyes had simply stopped, Hugo Rodriguez walked back to his apartment on Verlaine Street with the book held against his chest, like a compress against a wound, and the March light that had seemed provisional an hour ago now seemed to him actively hostile. The city, his ordinary morning beauty, a kind of cruelty. The indifference of the living world to the specific crisis of one man, as interior siege rendered suddenly it personally offensive, in the way that only the genuinely desperate experience the happiness of others. He read while he walked, which he had never done before, had always considered an affectation, but the urgency of the arithmetic, 1 night remaining, the 10th set of numbers arriving with the dark, something else beginning, had dissolved his relationship with all previous personal policies. Hugo Reyes wrote the way a man writes when he knows he is writing against time, and for an audience he cannot predict, in a register simultaneously clinical and confessional that Hugo Rodriguez found almost unbearably recognizable. The voice of a mind that has been forced by extraordinary circumstance to examine itself with a thoroughness that ordinary life never demands and never should. The prose was dense and recursive and occasionally brilliant, looping back upon itself the way thought actually moves rather than the way thought is represented as moving in texts that have been tidied for public consumption. The core argument was this: the listener was not, despite the mythology that had accumulated around it across generations of terrified witnesses, a supernatural entity in any traditional theological sense. It was something considerably stranger and considerably more intimate, a form of consciousness, or something that functioned analogously to consciousness, that existed in the spaces between minds, that fed not on fear or pain or the Gothic currencies of conventional horror, but on interiority itself, on the specific and irreplaceable flavor of an individual mind, continuous self, narration. Each human consciousness generated, Reyes argued with the careful and slightly manic precision of a man who has had a great deal of time to think in a hospital bed, a kind of signal, not metaphorical, not spiritual, but something with genuine if unmeasured physical properties. Something that propagated through spaces the way sound propagates through air, and the listener had evolved or been formed or simply was, in relation to that signal the way a deep sea creature is in relation to the particular pressure of its environment. It did not choose its targets arbitrarily. It found minds with a specific quality of signal, intense recursive self, aware to an unusual degree, capable of the kind of sustained interior complexity that the listener found. Reyes speculated with a detachment Hugo found either admirable or dissociative, nourishing. The speaking of the name was not an invocation in any magical sense, but a tuning fork. It produced a vibration that allowed the listener to locate and lock onto a signal it had perhaps been sensing vaguely for some time, the way a radio dial finds a station it has been circling. Hugo stopped walking on the corner of a lane and Marsh and stood very still. It had been sensing him vaguely for some time. He thought about the months before Marco's party, the months before the name spoken in ironic fearlessness before an audience of graduate students and cheap wine. He thought about the quality of his sleep in that period, the dreams he had attributed to dissertation stress, the recurring sensation of being observed that he had attributed to the particular paranoia of a man in the final stages of producing an original intellectual contribution and terrified of being found insufficient. He thought about his cat. Not his cat, the cat rebel, who had appeared on a windowsill that had been closed. He opened the book to the index with the urgent single-mindedness of a man who has just understood that the map he is reading has more information on it than he initially registered. Cats, the index read, see page 89. Page 80. 9 was a single paragraph, dense and almost casual in its delivery, the way Reyes delivered the information he found most significant, as though understatement were a form of respect for the reader's intelligence. Those who have encountered the listener over extended periods report, with a consistency that exceeds coincidence, the appearance of a black cat in their living space. I will not speculate extensively on the nature or origin of these animals as I have insufficient data, but I will record my own experience. The cat that appeared in my apartment on the 3rd night did not eat, did not drink, did not sleep, and could not be touched by anyone other than myself. It appeared to perceive something in the room that I could not perceive directly, and on 2 occasions it interposed itself physically between myself and the corner of the room where I most strongly felt the listener's attention concentrated. Whether these animals are sent, whether they arrive of their own volition, whether they are something other than what they appear, I cannot say. What I can say is this. When I finally succeeded in completing the process I will describe in the following chapter, the cat was gone before I opened my eyes. I do not know where it went. I choose to believe it went somewhere good. Hugo closed the book. He stood on the corner for a moment that felt longer than its objective duration, feeling the city move around him with its indifferent momentum. And he thought about Rebel with a feeling that he did not immediately have a name for, and then recognized as grief. Preemptive grief. The grief of anticipated loss. Which is in some ways the most honest grief, because it is not complicated by shock. He thought about what it meant that the book existed, that Hugo Reyes had written it, that Hugo Reyes had therefore survived, had not simply stopped as the newspaper had reported, but had found some way through and had spent whatever time remained to him afterward, documenting the passage, so that the next person standing on this particular precipice would not be entirely without a map. He opened to the final chapter. He read it standing on the corner of Verlaine and Marsh, while the city moved around him, and the March light shifted toward afternoon, and somewhere above the cloud cover the sun performed its indifferent transit. And when he finished reading, he stood very still for a long time, not thinking, genuinely not thinking. And the achievement of that stillness in the middle of the day, the middle of the city without preparation or effort, told him something important about how far he had come in 3 weeks of terrible education. Then he walked the remaining block to his building, climbed the 4 flights of stairs. The elevator had been broken since January, and the super was a man who experienced urgency as a concept applicable only to other people, and unlocked his apartment door and stepped inside. Rebel was sitting in the center of the kitchen floor. Not at the window. Not against the wall. The center of the floor, equidistant from every surface. In a posture Hugo had not seen from the cat before. Upright, formal, both front paws precisely together, like an image from an Egyptian frieze, like something that had decided to stop pretending to be merely a cat. The wall behind it showed 10 sets of numbers. The 10th had arrived early. And below the sentence that had been accumulating in Hugo's handwriting across 9 nights, there was now a final addition, the sentence completed at last, and Hugo read it with the strange calm of a man who has read the final chapter and knows what is required of him. You already invited me in, and I have been here longer than you have. The breathing in his ear began again, and this time it was not subtle, not the intimate whisper of something concealing its presence. It was enormous. It filled the apartment. It filled Hugo, his chest cavity and the spaces between his thoughts. And it carried in it that sub-linguistic address to the part of Hugo that existed before he had learned to call himself Hugo, that ancient and pre-verbal self that the listener had been patiently excavating for 3 weeks, like an archaeologist removing layers of accumulated civilization to reach the original site. Hugo set the book on the kitchen table. He looked at Rebel. The cat looked back at him with those amber eyes in which Hugo could now read, with the fluency of someone who has spent 3 weeks learning a new language under the most motivating possible conditions. Not pity, not warning, not grief, but something that had been there all along beneath those other communications, something he had not had the stillness to perceive until now. Encouragement. You know what to do, those eyes said. Hugo Reyes knew. Now you know, the question is whether you can do it. Hugo Rodriguez pulled out a chair, sat down at his kitchen table with the book before him, and the numbers on his wall, and the breathing filling every available space, and he began to prepare himself for the thing that Hugo Reyes had described in the final chapter, the thing that was not silence, the thing that the silence had only been preparing him for. The act of making himself so completely, so devastatingly, so exhaustively known to the thing that was listening that it would have nowhere left to go. To turn the interior so entirely outward that there would be no interiority remaining for the listener to feed upon. To become voluntarily and completely. He had 1 night to do it. He thought he understood. Now what it would cost. He thought he was willing to pay it outside his window. The March light finally failed, and the 10th night began. Hugo Rodriguez had spent his entire adult life carefully curating the distance between what he was and what he permitted the world to see, and he understood now, sitting at his kitchen table on the 10th night with the breathing enormous around him, and Rebel's amber gaze steady upon him, and the book of Hugo Reyes open to its final chapter. That this curation had been not protection but invitation, that the listener had not found him despite his interiority, but because of it, because a mind that spends decades building walls around its most essential self generates, in the building an extraordinary signal, the psychic equivalent of a lighthouse. Visible for great distances, to anything that hungers for what such walls contain, he had to take the walls down, all of them. Completely. Without reservation or remainder, Hugo Reyes had described the process in language that was precise and merciless and occasionally beautiful in the way that only the most honest things are beautiful. And Hugo Rodriguez had read it 3 times on the corner of Verlaine and Marsh, and had understood it intellectually with the fluency of a man trained in close reading, and had understood it not at all in the way that matters, the way that understanding must reach before it becomes action, rather than knowledge. But sitting now in the 10th night with the arithmetic exhausted, and the darkness outside his window absolute, and the listener's breathing pressing against the walls of his consciousness like water against a dam that has been weakening for 3 weeks, he found that the intellectual understanding had done its work quietly while he was occupied with other things, had filtered down through the layers of his consciousness and arrived at the place where action originates, and he was ready in the way that one is sometimes ready for the thing one has been dreading, not without fear, but beyond the point where fear is the deciding variable. He began with his father. Not because his father was the most significant thing he contained, but because his father was the thing he had kept most completely, most deliberately, most expensively hidden. From friends, from Elena, from Dr. Reyes, from everyone who had attempted over the years to know Hugo Rodriguez with any genuine depth. The man who had left when Hugo was 9 and had returned when Hugo was 26, as though the intervening years were a minor interruption, a scheduling conflict now resolved, and Hugo had let him return with a graciousness that had cost him more than anyone had known, because he had never told anyone what the leaving had cost him the first time. Had never told anyone about the 9-year-old who had constructed from that abandonment an entire philosophy of self-sufficiency, an entire architecture of not needing, which had seemed like strength for 25 years, and which he now understood had been the foundation of everything the listener had found so exquisitely, so abundantly nourishing. He said it aloud to the empty kitchen, not performed, not therapeutic, not the managed disclosure of a man in a doctor's office selecting which truths to present. But the raw and unmediated thing, the version that existed before language translated into language as faithfully as language permitted, which was imperfectly but honestly. The breathing faltered. The faltering was subtle, a single missed rhythm, in the otherwise immaculate patience of the thing's respiration. And Hugo felt it the way one feels the first give in something that has been held rigid, that first infinitesimal surrender of structure that precedes collapse. And it was the most encouraging thing he had felt in 3 weeks, and it was terrifying, and he continued. His mother's grief, which he had witnessed and never acknowledged witnessing. His dissertation, which he believed privately, and had never told anyone was not as original as the committee had determined. Not fraudulent, not stolen, but not the genuine contribution he had needed it to be. The secret suspicion of his own intellectual inadequacy that had lived beneath his professional confidence, like a second floor to a building whose existence was not on the official plans. Elena, the other Elena, the one who had taken her houseplants, and the specific way he had failed her. Not the version he had constructed for the telling, the version in which incompatibility was the protagonist and no one was particularly culpable, but the true version in which he had been so committed to not needing that he had made her feel. Consistently, and over a long period of time, like a woman pressing her hands against glass. The breathing stuttered again, then again. Rebel made a sound, not the keen of warning, not the subsonic vibration of alarm, but something Hugo had not heard from the cat in 3 weeks of strange companionship, something so unexpected in the context of everything the night contained that it took him a moment to identify it. The cat was purring. Not the soft mechanical purring of comfort and warmth, but something larger, more deliberate, a sound that seemed to come from a place deeper than the small body should have been able to contain, resonant and sustained and directed, aimed at the presence in the apartment the way sound can be aimed, the way certain frequencies can shatter certain structures. And Hugo understood without being told that Rebel was doing something, was contributing something to the process, was fulfilling whatever the purpose of its 3-week vigil had always been leading toward this precise moment. On this 10th and final night, Hugo continued. He went deeper. The things he had never said to his grandmother before she died, which he would not write here because they belonged to her and to him, and the telling of them into the dark kitchen on Verlaine Street was enough. Was the point the listener receiving them in all their unmediated rawness, this thing that had never encountered a mind that had turned itself entirely outward, that had always fed in the comfortable dark of concealment, and now found itself flooded with a quality of light it had no apparatus for processing, his loneliness. Not the social loneliness of a man who needs more friends, but the ontological loneliness of a man who has never been fully present in any room he has inhabited, always partially elsewhere, always maintaining the reserve that had felt like dignity, and been, in truth, a form of disappearance. The way he had been disappearing, incrementally, for 34 years, and had not known it until a thing that fed on interiority began to show him, by its hunger, exactly how much of himself he had been hoarding in the dark. The breathing was ragged now, irregular, disrupted. The patience of it, that extraordinary inhuman patience that had been perhaps its most terrifying quality, was gone, replaced by something that Hugo could only describe as disorientation. The listener encountering for the first time a mind that had nothing left inside it, that was not also outside it. A consciousness without shadow. Without the concealed and private spaces in which it had been taking up residence, as though the interior of Hugo Rodriguez were a building it had been squatting in for weeks, room by room, and now the building had no rooms, had no walls, had been opened so completely to the outside that inside and outside were no longer meaningful distinctions. It had nowhere to be. Not dramatically. Not with any of the Gothic theatre he might have expected from 3 weeks of Gothic circumstance. It simply withdrew, the way a held breath is released, the way pressure equalizes, and the apartment on Verlaine Street was suddenly and absolutely only an apartment. 4 walls, a kitchen table, a book, a man, a cat. The ordinary darkness of an ordinary March night in an ordinary city going about its ordinary business entirely indifferent to the extraordinary thing that had just occurred within one of its 10,000 illuminated or unilluminated windows. Hugo Rodriguez sat at his kitchen table and breathed, just breathed. Rebel stood, stretched with the full dramatic commitment that cats bring to stretching, crossed the table and placed its small dark head beneath Hugo's hand, with a deliberateness that was nothing like a request and everything like a completion. The gesture of something that has finished what it came to do and is taking a moment before whatever comes next. To simply be present with the person it has been present with through the hardest thing that person has ever done. Hugo scratched behind the cat's ears. His phone showed no new messages. The kitchen wall was blank, not painted over, not cleaned. Simply blank. The numbers gone as though they had never been. And Hugo looked at the blankness for a long time and felt something he had not felt in 3 weeks and had not. He now understood, felt in considerably longer than 3 weeks. He felt the specific and irreplaceable relief of a man who has finally completely and without reservation been known, and has discovered that what is known can no longer be used against him, that exposure is not destruction, that the self one has been most carefully concealing is not the self's most shameful contents, but its most essential ones, and that the listener had been, in its terrible impatient way, doing him a violence and also, inadvertently, the most profound service, showing him, by the precise location of its hunger, exactly where he had been most alive and most hidden. He would call his sister in the morning. He would say the things he had not said. He would, at his next appointment, tell Dr. Reyes the true version of Elena, the one with no one conveniently blameless. He would find Marco. He did not know what he would find when he found Marco, and he sat with that not knowing the way he was learning to sit with things, without the compulsive need to resolve them into narrative, into meaning, into the managed story of a man who has processed his difficulty and emerged intact. Perhaps intact was not the right aspiration. Perhaps intact had always been the wrong aspiration. He looked down at Rebel. The cat was gone. Not gone from the room, gone entirely, as Hugo Reyes had written before I opened my eyes, and Hugo had not closed his eyes, had not looked away for more than a moment, and yet the space where the cat had been contained nothing now, but the faint warmth of recent presence and the echo of that purposeful, resonant purring that Hugo suspected he would hear, in the way one hears things that have mattered for the rest of his life. I choose to believe it went somewhere good Hugo Reyes had written. Hugo Rodriguez, sitting alone in his kitchen on Verlaine Street in the ordinary dark of an ordinary March night, chose the same. He closed the book. He left it on the table. He went to bed, and he slept without dreaming, and in the morning the city was still there, indifferent and beautiful, and absolutely mercifully, full of nothing but noise.